Hey YouTube, Alex Conley here today, and I got another video for you. This video is some of the disadvantages of learning a new language. So some of you might be wondering, disadvantages, I thought it was all good to learn another language, and there are tons of advantages. I discussed some of them in my previous video, advantages of learning a new language. But in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the downsides. So the first and most obvious one is you might not like what you hear. Sometimes if people perceive you to not understand their language, they can say some ugly or mean, nasty things in your presence that you're not familiar with. You can check Reddit for some of these stories. There's some really funny and sad stories of people assuming that another individual does not speak their language and then being really embarrassed or shocked when that individual does speak their language. So right off the bat, some people just say disrespectful or nasty things and assume, oh, they don't know any better, they can't understand me. Oh, they're American, they don't speak whatever language that I speak, but in fact, you might. So if you do speak another language, understand another language, comprehend another language, you may start to hear things that you don't like and you wish you hadn't understood. There's all kinds of directions that can go in. And conversely, sometimes the things aren't always negative. Sometimes you'll hear something that's humorous and you'll be glad you understood, but you might hear some things you don't like. So something to consider before you learn another language. Next, you may not understand the written language. So if you're an English speaker and you're learning like German or Spanish, you'll probably be able to figure out, the written language relatively easily. But if you're talking about like Japanese, like kanji or hiragana, good luck. It's going to take you a lot of careful, hard work, patience, and effort to even begin to understand some of the written language. Much less complex structures like books and religious texts and similar things. So keep in mind that just because you understand the spoken language, you may even learn the intricacies of the spoken language. That's not going to always translate to the written language, and you may feel like you're back at square one trying to learn the characters and how to comprehend the nonverbal communication, basically. So while you can learn another language, it's not going to change your ethnicity. So I'm part Japanese, but in Japan, by most people's standards, part Japanese is not Japanese. Basically, unless you are totally Japanese, you're in some regards just not considered Japanese. I mean, I've read stories of people that are half Japanese that have lived in Japan their whole lives that have a hard time getting an apartment because of negative bias toward foreign people. And if you're half, and you have a Western name, that's definitely going to set off some alarm bells immediately. Just because sometimes in Japan, if a Japanese individual has had negative experiences with foreign people, they may make the assumption that all foreign people are going to act similarly to the negative experience or negative encounter. So keep in mind that even if you understand a new language, you're not going to change the physical perceptions and some of the biases that people may have in their own minds toward people of your background. So when I was in Japan, I'm a fourth Japanese, but I would just tell people I'm half Japanese because trying to explain that I'm a fourth Japanese just starts to get really convoluted. And even then, people still, treated me like a foreign person, which, I was born in the United States, so technically, even though I'm ethnically part Japanese, I'm an American. And so I was generally treated like an American, which in Japan can be a good and a bad thing. The good part is they don't hold you to the same standards as they would a Japanese person. The bad thing is they tend to not have very strong expectations of you, which to some people might be good, but it can definitely be a little bit disheartening when you get the impression that people expect you to do the wrong thing. And actually, I was raised by my Japanese grandmother, so I'm actually pretty familiar with many of the social rules, the intricacies of Japanese culture. So I actually did not break the rules too often. But that's something to keep in mind, that if you even if you learn some basic Japanese, like even though I know some basic Japanese, I'm still not going to be regarded as an ethnically Japanese person. So multilingual people tend to be weaker in both languages. So there's this perception like, oh, if you learn another language, you'll be smarter. And there may be some benefits as far as cognitively speaking, but your original language will tend to suffer, and your new language will not be as strong as a native speaker. Because you're swapping between the two, because you may use one a lot more than the other, it just doesn't it doesn't seem to work as well. It seems like for the most part, if you do learn multiple languages, that it's going to hurt both your original language and your new language. My grandmother makes a comment often that with her Japanese friends, she has stronger English but weaker Japanese, and they often have stronger Japanese but weaker English. So she's never said, oh, we all speak Japanese and English perfectly. It's not the case. So keep in mind that if you're wanting to learn another language, make sure you have intentions of making use of the language that you're learning. Make sure that you have intentions of it being worth your while, because it would not be good to have the drawbacks that you didn't realize. So yeah, just keep in mind, being multilingual does have some disadvantages. If you're looking to be in a career or position where you primarily use one language, you may just stick to that language and try to use translation apps, hang out with local friends that are multilingual, and kind of get around it that way. Don't necessarily feel like you have to learn another language. Finally, so this is kind of the last point that I want to make. Keep in mind that if you're learning another language, this new language may be limited in use. So I mentioned Japanese. Japanese is predominantly spoken in Japan and is pretty rare outside of Japan. There's not tons of Japanese people living outside of Japan. There's certainly some Japanese people living outside of Japan, but Japan's a nice place to live. It's, generally speaking, it's a nice country to live in. It's modern. There's clean water. Accommodation is of strong standards. There's public transportation. The food is good. There's not a whole lot of reason to leave Japan, especially now. Now, during the World War II era, it's a little bit different story, but so outside of Japan, you're probably not going to use Japanese a whole lot. So you may want to learn Japanese, and Japanese is a beautiful language. It's a wonderful language. I have some interest in possibly living in Japan at some point, so I look at it occasionally. I really enjoyed my visit to Japan, but I'm speaking of this fully knowing that outside of Japan, the language might not be super useful. Whereas if you're talking about Spanish or Mandarin or English, these are somewhat global languages. These are some languages that are spoken around the world, that you're not going to just have one country that language is spoken in. Kind of following up on that, Japan has around 100 million people. So if you learn Japanese, there's roughly that many people that you can communicate with. With English is kind of a universal language. Most people around the world that are engaging in business, that are engaging in education, they're going to learn at least a little bit of English. Mandarin is the primary language of China, and similarly, people that are wanting to do business in China, it would behoove them to learn some basic Mandarin. With Spanish, Spanish is prevalent throughout the United States. It's prevalent in Spain, prevalent in Mexico. It's also a good language that is not limited to one country. But if you're talking about Japanese or like say Thai, there's 67 million people in Thailand. So your language, while it's a beautiful language, while it has plenty of utility in the country of origin, it may not be the most valuable on a large scale unless you plan to live there for a long time. And if you plan to live in a certain country for a long time, the usefulness of using it in your day-to-day life will override the obscurity of that language or the niche factor of that language. But don't feel like you need to learn a ton of words in this niche language if you're just going there on vacation, if you're just visiting. Keep in mind that it's a big time investment to learn a new language. It can be a financial investment because you're going to want to make use of it by, say, visiting that country. If you live far from that country, air travel can be expensive. It can be expensive to take a lot of time off work when you consider wages, salary, and all that. So I hope these have been helpful. I do think there are some disadvantages to learning a new language. I don't think it's all negative, but I don't think it's all quite positive either. So let me know what you think down in the comments. If you are multilingual, if you speak multiple languages, tell us about your experiences. I want to hear more and to kind of share these types of things with the viewers, the audience, and see what they have to say. So appreciate you watching, and if you enjoy this video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you next time.